the ability to get something and launch something is quite easy, and so the barriers are extremely low. Setting up, a newsletter is quite easy, right?
You, I believe, make around $500,000, like $500,000 approximately this year. How do you make that work?
The quality of the journalism is what drives people to become members. Journalism is not necessarily that complicated. It's like produce really good journalism.
I wrote down something you said. You actually don't want to listen to your audience as much as some of these people say that you do.
What people are willing to pay for is very different from what they're willing to sort of say that they want. The job of journalists is to spark curiosity and interest in people, bring them towards things that they might not necessarily even know that they're interested in.
What have you found really does not work? Like, what have the failures been in trying to convert people to paid subscriptions?
It is tough.
Welcome back to the Creator Spotlight Podcast. My name is Francis Zierer, and today we are speaking with Geoff Sharpe, the founder of Lookout Media, a local news company up in Canada. He has 4 newsletters across Ottawa, Vancouver, and the Yukon. And what's special about this one compared to some of the other local media entrepreneur types I've had on here is he monetizes primarily through paid subscriptions, about 75% mix paid subscriptions and advertising. And he also focuses on hard news, on journalism. He has reporters on staff, whereas a bunch of the other people I've spoken to in this sort of new local media entrepreneur space are primarily monetizing through advertising and running newsletters that are largely based on local event aggregation, which Geoff does too, but also with a lot more original reporting. This was a really good conversation. I hope you enjoy. You currently have 4 total newsletters under your business. It's the Ottawa Lookout, Capital Eats, Van City Lookout, and Yukon Lookout. And I understand that you're on a rate of maybe $500,000 approximately, $500,000 approximately this year.
Getting close, I would say. Yeah, that would be like the stretch goal. But yeah.
Yeah. And so you're 4 years in. I think November was when you first launched. Tell me, you've got 4 now. Has it been like just one every year, or what's the order it's been of launching these?
We started in a city called Ottawa in Canada, and then moved over to Vancouver, and then doing one up in the Yukon. The way it sort of worked has been like every 2 years, I guess you could say. But I think we're trying to move into more of a 1-year thing based on how things are going. But we'll see. But it's sort of it has changed a little bit too in terms of what we're looking for and how we're doing it, which I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, that's been sort of the timeline.
Yeah. Okay. Longtime listeners will have listened to my episodes with Ryan Snedden, Michael Kaufman, Landon Huslig in that order. These guys are really talented local media, local newsletter entrepreneurs. But part of why I've been looking forward to speaking with you is from everything you've told me about how your business operates, it's a little different. These guys are doing largely events aggregation and advertiser supported. These are free products. There's no subscription. I believe, make around 75% of the revenue comes from paid subscriptions, 25% is from ads. So it's a very different business. You're also more trafficking in actual news, in hard news. You do the event aggregation, but it's a lot more than that, correct?
Yeah, you summed it up really nicely.
That's my job. Okay. How do you make that work? Like if I've talked to all these people who have this really solid model, and I've spoken to some people who do more like actual reporting and producing original information. I'm thinking of this one person in particular, Umbreen Ali, who I spoke to last summer, and she runs this grant-funded journalism project in New Jersey. There are paid subscriptions, but they monetize through grants. And so my basic understanding is that it is relatively easy to let's not to say it's the simplest thing, but it's relatively easy to spin up a events aggregation, advertiser supported local media company than it is to do what you're doing, which is more reporting based and more subscription based. What makes it work? Which is a big question, but like we'll go out from there.
Well, I think the first thing, just to talk on your point about growth, I think we've kind of entered a world where spooling up Facebook ads, setting up, a newsletter, a Beehive, whatever it may be, is quite easy, right? So we're in a situation now where I think the ability to get something and launch something is quite easy, and so the barriers are extremely low. If you have a couple grand, you can get a newsletter going, especially on the local side where ad costs are quite low, pretty fast. And so for a lot of people who are starting them, they're more entrepreneurs, right? They see an opportunity, and there definitely is opportunities there. But a lot of them are not necessarily what you'd say like are journalists, right? Or want to work with journalists. They're more interested in sort of, the events, look at 6 a.m. City and what they're doing. It's an incredible quite a big business that they're building based on good news and event curation and things like that. The way I've sort of approached it and when we started it was saw a market opportunity for building something that was a little bit more news heavy, focused on newsletters, bringing in a little bit of like Axios, Puck, even a bit of 6 a.m. City as well, and delivering that over email. And so the reason we went that route was, 2 reasons. One, my former co-founder was a journalist, and so it made sense to do that. And second, my background in work that I've done lends itself to building that type of product. I actually did, a long time ago, experiment with like just a good news newsletter, and that, that was interesting too. But, what we sort of pushed into was, okay, like we have this experience with journalism. We know how to do this. We know that there's models out there that work really well. My background, having worked with journalists, I run like, marketing. I do my own sort of agency work, paid growth acquisition, membership engagement, things like that. I've worked a lot with nonprofits and charities. So I also understand how to turn someone from sort of a engaged reader and user and push them towards actually making sort of a purchase decision, giving up their money for something that's maybe a little bit less tangible than just a product. And there's a lot of steps to go into doing that just a lot of, quite frankly, a lot of people just don't necessarily know how to do. And I can totally understand why a lot of local newsletter operators are staying away from that type of stuff, because it does take a certain set of skills and mindset and like, ability to work with journalists and things like that allows you to sort of push into that space. So not everyone, I would say, can do that, or frankly should do that. And there's positives and negatives to either sort of business model. But we found a really good medium between all of them and how it all works, which, I'm sure we'll talk about as we go.
Yeah. Okay. There's basically the entire rest of the episode is contained in all the threads you just put down there. But something I want to talk about first. When I first met you about a month ago, we spoke. I wrote down something you said. You were giving me this contrarian advice that you actually don't want to listen to your audience as much as some of these people say that you do. Right? Like if you just ran surveys and what does your audience want, you might end up just realizing that they just want events aggregation. They don't want hard news. Don't poke the bear. Don't put in anything that could be polarizing in any way. And I wrote down what you said. You said, if we followed what our audience wants, we would just be an events newsletter. And clearly that is not what you do. That's not what you want to do. Tell me about this. I guess this is a matter of revealed preferences, right? The audience might say they want this one thing, but they actually do want this more complex product.
And I certainly said that not to be contrary. And I think there's certainly elements of like, you have to listen to your audience. And we absolutely do that. We're doing a lot of surveys. We're constantly looking and seeing what engages people. But you have to, especially if you're in sort of this type of space, making editorial decisions about what you want to cover and things like that. You have to choose what you don't do as well as what you do. And so again, it comes back to like understanding where you're approaching things. So like, there's journalists could write about anything, right? Like there's millions and millions of things to write about, but by choosing what they do, they set their editorial standards of how they want to cover stuff. And so for us, we always see lots of clicks on events. Readers tell us time and time again, they come to us for events. But if we became a purely an events-based newsletter, like a lot of other places, people wouldn't really be willing to pay sort of that $100 a year, $10 a month to support us, because you can go out and find events in a lot of other ways too. There's a utility function, of course, of saying, give me events and that type of thing. But the reason we've stayed away from that and don't listen to our audience in that regard is just because we know that by putting together really good journalism through testing, through seeing what sort of gets engagement, that what people are willing to pay for is very different from what they're willing to sort of say that they want, right? And so I think for a lot of these other newsletters, it makes total sense to go that route because they're not doing a membership and paywalled funded model, whereas we are. So we also don't necessarily just listen to like what people say they want in terms of story topics either, because the job of a media company and journalists is to spark curiosity and interest in people and bring them towards things that they might not necessarily even know that they're interested in, right? So if I only did what people told us to cover in terms of topics, it would be an event-based newsletter and a real estate based newsletter.
Because part of running a media company and making editorial decisions is giving an audience what they don't know that they want.
Exactly. And so from that standpoint, you don't want to listen entirely to your audience. I think taking cues and knowing where those guardrails are about what you should do and shouldn't do is super valuable. And a lot of traditional publications do not do that. But I would say if you're almost looking at it as a spectrum, you've got like on the far side, traditional news outlets that like don't really a lot of times listen to their audience at all. And then on the other side, maybe you have people who are entirely listening to their audience and shaping it entirely that way. We sit in that middle spot where it's like, yes, we will hear what people say, but we know the topics that people are willing to pay for, and we know what our audience is willing to engage with. But we also have the editorial stuff that we're focused on, and that's what keeps people sort of opening the newsletter and engaging.
Hi there, my name's Tom, and I'm the producer here on Creator Spotlight. I promise we'll get back to the episode in about 30 seconds or so, but just before I sat down to edit this episode with Geoff, I was looking through our YouTube analytics. And I realized that around 70% of you that regularly watch our show are not actually subscribed to the channel. And I thought that was wild. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized that's kind of normal with YouTube. I'm the same. You watch the same videos over and over from the same channels, and YouTube just keeps recommending it. So you don't actually need to subscribe. But the thing is, we've got some new content in the works, as well as this regular weekly episode that we do. We're going to be putting out some breakdown videos, highlights, and some new formats that are going to shake things up a little bit. So make sure you're subscribed. If you want to learn the absolute most from the creators that we have on, then subscribe to the channel and we'll repay the favor by trying to improve the videos every week and put out more content for you.
Yeah. Okay. Backing up a little bit here. You are not a journalist. You founded this with somebody who was a journalist who you no longer work with. It strikes me that is probably a big reason why you've had some success. I think that I see people who maybe have a background in journalism, but they never really had much of a background in the business side. They weren't really exposed to that. And it's often harder for these people to set up a business like yours and build these structures, build these revenue streams. Say a little bit more. We don't have to do a full history of your career, but like in as much as you've worked in nonprofits, I believe you've done some work with the government. Like, what is this work you're alluding to where you worked a lot with journalists and that has helped you understand how to do sort of both sides of this business, which is the business and the editorial side?
Yeah. So I worked in sort of the nonprofit media space for a while. I did sort of like started like a social media page and then started working with journalists to like write different stuff. But I would say like most of my experience that comes to bear here is just like working, I guess, in like a team setting, you could say, or running sort of agency stuff. So I think, the experience of working with, a team and journalists is basically like, you have to set the direction of what you want and then put sort of guardrails around like, yes, this is what we want to cover, don't want to cover. And the skills that I'm sort of bringing to the table with these journalists is like, they don't have to worry about the business operations. They don't have to worry about the audience growth piece. They don't have to even worry about necessarily generating members or revenue per se. It's giving them sort of the tools to work with, how we want these stories structured, and then also like working with them on stuff that does resonate with them and guiding them that way. And so, I not to get too deep into it, but the process I use for this and my agency and all the other stuff I worked on is the Entrepreneurial Operating System by Gino Wickman. I'm sure other of your guests have talked about it, but that has been sort of a way to unlock, everyone's ability to do stuff by just having a clear business structure of how to approach, quarterly goals, yearly goals, what our values are. Using all of that has really helped, I think, unlock everyone's expertise and being able to work together on this stuff.
See, that's really interesting you say that because, it's aka EOS as it's abbreviated. I don't think it's ever come up on the show though, as an employee of Beehive, like it's something that I believe we use at Beehive, and I've bought the book because I knew we were using that EOS, and so I wanted to read a little bit about it. But I think this is precisely like, you say it kind of offhand, but I think this is precisely the difference that like a lot of people who don't have any background in business and just producing editorial, they wouldn't have heard of that thing. And like they're like these kind of like ways of structuring a business and structuring a team and like splitting up functions and stuff that can be kind of table stakes for the modern entrepreneur. I think the modern journalist who's becoming a creator journalist isn't necessarily as exposed to those things, right?
No, totally. I mean, for journalists, like I said, I've worked with quite a few. They're mostly focused on just writing really good journalism, and and for a lot of them, it's they don't think about that other piece, and that's not their job necessarily either. And so that's where I've come in and be able to help is say like, look, like I can plug you in as a local journalist in the city. I can plug you into this system that we know works, these templates that work, this approach to membership that works, the type of stories and sort of product-based newsletter that's going to actually drive members and signups. And, you can have your editorial focus on sort of building out sort of the best stuff in the city. And so that sort of approach of like taking a real business lens on stuff is not really something I think. We're going back to like some of the other local journalists that you mentioned. A lot of them are more entrepreneurial and are probably thinking that way, but they're not necessarily doing the journalist stuff. So my role a lot of times is like bridging that gap and serving that function to like elevate and bring the journalism more to people in a way that's actually going to like generate good revenue, for the business and for the journalists.
Yeah. How much of the revenue, let's say if you're hitting that $500,000 run rate, how much of this revenue are you putting back into the business? Because I think you make your living through your agency, Sharpe Strategies, right? Like this, do you pull salary from Lookout?
Well, yeah, and I try to be transparent about this. I mean, technically, I've quote unquote lost money on it because I just not to get too deep into it, but I gave a loan to that business to start it and stuff like that, and I haven't paid it back, but I don't need to, but it is profitable. So I should make that clear, but I'm putting the profits back into the business. So I have not paid myself any like salary or dividends or anything like that. Like my focus is purely on like growing this into something that, can be sustainable in a lot of different cities, right? At some point I will have to, as I sort of move away from doing all my other work. But, for me, it's I'm fortunate enough that I've got, my other agency work that helps, pay the bills, and I can focus on this as sort of like a long-term business piece. And then, like for me, it's like, well, if the choice is between paying myself and I don't need to and hiring another journalist, I'm going to hire another journalist every single time.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think, a difference from the other folks I've talked to who are like, so like they put all their time into this and they want it to be this lifestyle business for them. And like, they don't have to add a journalist to the mix, right? That only complicates things. So I think you're rare in that you are kind of prioritizing the journalism, and it is important for you to put the money back into hiring journalists. So your team, it's 4 people, right?
Yeah, so I can talk through the team function.
Yeah.
So like, my role is sort of the, CEO visionary, the
publisher,
the EOS publisher, that the EOS model visionary operator, all that type of stuff. And technical term would be publisher, but I also serve as like the managing editor of like reviewing content, working with the team, stuff like that.
You do some of the writing sometimes too, right?
I do some of the writing too. So I actually really enjoy doing like food review writing. So like I could talk about that in a second too.
I've read your burger reviews.
Yeah, there you go. So there's like each city has its own sort of like journalist. They also have in Ottawa, we have like a food writer. As well. I do food writing in Vancouver as well. And so like basically right now it's like one journalist in each city. Ideally there's like a food writer there, and the journalist is doing like, there's a mix of everything. So when, not to get too deep into it, but those are basically the functions. We also just hired a salesperson, and we're trying to hire another journalist to help with both publications as sort of like a senior editor. And so we just hired a salesperson. I already mentioned that. And so the functions are basically like the journalists do, all the writing, things like that. I'll help pitch in on sort of like the newsletter product. So it's a 3 times a week newsletter that goes out. We're not churning out like 2 to 3 articles a day. It's like 1 article per newsletter, a bit more in depth. So the journalists are working on sort of the really in-depth journalism piece. I'm pitching in on like putting the events in the newsletter. And they're writing other newsletter summary stuff. And then we have our food writers, quote unquote, my colleague in Ottawa, and then myself. We're doing like pretty in-depth restaurant review stuff. So think like New York Times style reviews, not clickbait, like, TikTok stuff that you see and like paid reviews. We don't do that. So we're going very back to like old school way of sort of restaurant stuff. And that's been incredibly popular. And we just like held an event too, which I can always talk about as well based on that. But yeah, those are sort of the functions right now that the team does. And, I try to let the journalists stay focused on, journalism, but they'll help like, upload stuff to Beehive and things like that and that type of stuff. But we are sort of figuring out, like how do you build this sustainably? And there's quite a few publications out there that are doing this in a similar way. So there's lots we can draw from, which is nice.
Are you tired of explaining the same thing over and over again to your coworkers? It's time to let AI do the explaining for you. Guide is a GPT-powered tool that helps you explain even the most complex tasks in seconds with AI-generated documentation. Just hit Capture on the Guide browser extension, and it automatically creates a step-by-step video guide complete with visuals, voiceover, and a call to action. Now, you can turn boring docs into stunning visual guides, share or embed them anywhere, and save hours per week. And the best part, the Guide extension is completely free. Go check it out at guide.com. That's GUIDDE.com. Yeah. I want to talk about the food aspect for a second. So you mentioned New York Times reviews. I'm a big food guy. I read a lot of New York Times food content, Eater, etc. I think it's worth noting how, it's expensive to do this well. And it's the typical, you go to a restaurant 3 times, the New York Times as well. Pete Wells, who he left, I think last summer now, but, he was kind of one of these last pseudo-anonymous critics. And now they have 2 people who, their faces are quite public and they're even doing video content. So it's like even this like kind of bastion of food criticism is changing. Eater as well. I think they've done a layoff at least once a year for the last 3 years. And they've restructured a lot. And now I don't think they actually have like a full, at least in New York, a senior food critic on staff. All of which is to say like, it's been interesting and a bit sad watching these things change. So I'm wondering, like, especially that you have like a dedicated, food journalist on staff. How do you guys make it work? Like, what are the editorial standards you guys practice for food journalism?
Well, and maybe just on the business side, total transparency too. Like the food stuff doesn't necessarily isn't really that profitable, but what it does do is a real retention aspect of like another piece that you can plug into the news that helps keep people and engage them in a completely different way.
Yeah.
On the editorial side of stuff, like when it comes to journalism stuff, like you kind of have to, you have like a set of like ethics that you follow and things like that. But like if you're a single journalist doing something, like you can do whatever you want. So it really comes down to like, your values of how you want to run it and being consistent on that. And for us, we don't take payment for a restaurant review. If someone like pays for a tour or something, we're very clear on that. And it's just people really, I would say the way to think about it is in the age of where you see these TikTok videos where it's like, come with me to this amazing new restaurant. There's a utility piece of food journalism where it's like, I need to go find somewhere to eat. Where should I go? That's great. But then there's also the like, I live in my city and I need someone trusted to tell me where to go and what to eat and what I should do with my afternoon. And so that's the spot we've really broken into, is like building a trust piece. So it's not just our brand that people trust. It's the food writer themselves. So we have a picture of them in the newsletter so people know who they are. This person is not anonymous, but they're also not just going to really expensive places, right? They're going to these affordable mom and pop places. The new family that just moved here 5 years ago from Sri Lanka has opened up a Sri Lankan restaurant and is doing incredible stuff. And that's the type of stories that we want to tell, is like the local fabric of the city. And while, people are not willing to pay for this stuff in the same way that they would with news, and we've tested this, we've won a paywall on our food stuff. What it does do is build up trust for ancillary stuff. So we ran our first event recently, $120 tickets sold out in a week. We've got more plans to do this. There's advertising, which also works for the food stuff, but it really helps solidify the mission of what we're doing, which is trying to help people understand and live their, best life in the city. And the food journalism comes from that. And so once you break that trust of like, oh yeah, you can pay us and we'll write something nice about you. Yeah. You lose that trust instantly. Like trust is so hard to build and so easy to lose that you just have to sort of stick with what you're doing. And so, I think that I've never been more excited about local journalism and even local food journalism, even with the stuff that's happening. And so I just see it as sort of a big component of what we're doing. Even if it doesn't generate members, it still has a huge role to play in sort of that intangible stuff too that maybe is like a little bit harder to measure.
Yeah, well, on that intangible, you just kept bringing up how this builds trust, right? Tell me a little bit about how you guys build and maintain that trust. Maybe do you have editorial guidelines, style guides that you like set from the very start and have just remained like ironclad? Tell me about that side of it.
Yeah, there's just standard journalism practices about, fact checking, getting sources, stuff like that. So, we follow all of that stuff. But if that was enough, then there wouldn't be a trust gap in journalism, right? And I think what we're trying to do with this and why email is so effective at this is because you can build not just like a relationship with the brand, but a relationship with the journalists and the people who are writing. So to give you an example, like our journalists in Ottawa, you can't go anywhere and do events without being stopped by people saying, hey, I read the newsletter. Hey, I love it. Thank you for everything you're doing. And, when you used to work at other publications, that never happened. Even some of these other bigger publications, this doesn't happen to these journalists. And so you see this with Puck and some of these other newsletters where there's a level of trust that's built up in the institutional brand, but also in the individual. And we're obviously seeing this with, the massive creator economy and everything else. But for us, it's a combination of the two. So you're getting with our brand, but then you also build that trust with the journalist who you see every day in your inbox. And so this is just a person who's like delivering you the news and is a trusted source. And so again, though, it's a fine line of like, how do you not break that trust? We get some complaints sometimes about different things, but I think if you're only listening to what your audience says, we wouldn't cover hard news, but that hard news by, us sourcing these issues and bringing it up with people has built a level of trust that, allows us to do a lot of interesting things and has built a really strong brand.
And gets people to pay for it. So I know that at the around the beginning of the year, I think, I can't remember if this is another podcast I listened to or an interview you did, you said that there were around 2,500 total paying members. I believe that most of these people are paying on an annual basis, not a monthly basis. And I want to break a lot down around this. But the first thing, I wonder, so I typically see two reasons that people pay for creator or new media products, right? One is to get information they can't get anywhere else, which that's why you're doing hard news, right? And then two is just kind of to support the creator or the endeavor on principle. So it seems like people pay both of these reasons influence why people pay you. I wonder if you think there's any other reasons besides those two.
Well, I'll have to fact check you on that. We're actually at 3,000 members now, but that's
amazing.
Because so we were at 2,500 before, we just hit 3,000. So it's growing fast, but I would say those are sort of like the two main reasons, right? Like there's obviously a million different models of how to do this, again, with like Puck News, you're paying to get these like insights into this industry that you need to know for your work. There's a great, for your job, like Financial Times, that type of thing. And then there's like the nonprofit news outlets where you're paying to support the journalism that you're seeing. And that's a model that like really works really well. And we're trying to bring both of them together. And I would be totally frank to say, like, I don't think we've found the perfect model between the two yet, but we're getting closer to it. In the sense that like by showing, our model works this way. Basically, we have a paywall on like, a couple stories a month. And then, but you're also paying to like, support the journalism. And that's a lot of the messaging that we use. You're also getting a couple other perks like, discounts to events, first access to events, eventually like commenting features, things like that. So we're always trying to think about what that mix of things is. And like, if anyone is thinking about doing this type of journalism too, I highly recommend, or news stuff, checking out The Mill UK. It's a UK publication that we've copied a lot of
based
stuff
in Manchester.
From. Manchester. And they have a whole network of things now. And so we're trying to do a bit of that. And I would say like the quality of the journalism is what drives people to become members, because they see the stories reflected in the places that they live. Mm-hmm. And one thing we've really pivoted towards recently is focusing more on like neighborhoods. And so like what's happening in this community. And so by bringing it even closer to people are willing to say, hey, I need to know what's going on in my backyard. I'm willing to become a member to do that. And so we're thinking about like more models around that, whether it's like, neighborhood newsletters, like what Block Club in Chicago's doing, or just like, sort of subject matter, topical newsletters that are related to certain niche communities. So yeah, it's a whole sort of like, just experimenting to see what works and, talking to the audience and sort of seeing where the metrics are. But, we haven't figured out the perfect model yet, but the mix of the two seems to work quite well.
One brief aside, with the Mill in Manchester, I'm always curious if independent media operators are like talking to each other and trading notes. Are you kind of just like watching and learning, or have you spoken with the people who run it?
I'm creeping from afar. I sent the owner there a message, and we never ended up connecting. But you can connect the dots in terms of like what places are doing. Like I would just say to take like a 40-foot, moving it really high up is like, journalism is not necessarily that complicated. It's like produce really good journalism, which like the Mill is just like, they're producing incredible stuff and they have just a great team of writers. And so I think that is a big part of it. If you're doing that, then like, as long as you have the business model stuff in place, I think it's a good time to be doing this stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So I understand, I don't know if this has changed as well, but I understand from one of these podcasts that around 25% of your revenue comes from a yearly December membership drive, which, makes me think of like growing up and listening to the radio on the way to school and the local radio station doing these membership drives, right? I think I've seen more people doing this. I know Project C, longtime listeners will know, Liz Kelly Nelson, past guests, like they've recently been doing this kind of, I think it's 32 independent journalists involved. Anyways, point is these membership drives seem to work really well. Tell me about your membership drive system.
Yeah, so this is modeled off of what nonprofits and charities have known for a long time, which is that, and NPR being a great example of that, is that campaigns as a mechanism for raising money work really well. And this is like, I would say like the media space is in the last like 5 to 10 years has finally started catching up to what nonprofits and charities have been doing a lot of. Like a lot of their revenue, vast majority comes from email, sort of like direct marketing type stuff. I mean, like e-commerce companies, same type of thing, huge revenue in email. So the way I approach this stuff and like the publications that are doing this type of stuff too is like, you kind of think of it as sort of like it's a big marketing campaign, but there's a few like component pieces that really go into that. So the first is some sort of like, mission or hook, right? So on our journalism side, it's like, for us, it recently was like, there's this big development happening in Ottawa that a lot of people are concerned about. So we launched a crowdfunding campaign to say, we're going to cover this story in depth, help get, become a member to help support this. So having some sort of mission tied to that is for us anyway, is really important because it's not just like, give us money so we can write. You have to put that meta narrative on it, right? And so having a sort of like mission around it, storytelling, sort of creating some sort of arc around this type of thing over like a month period, right? Where it's like, here's the issue that we want to address. Hey, we just wrote about a story about this and this is what we discovered. Now we want to get more in depth into it. Okay, we've got 5 writers who want to write this story. Like, that's why we need this money. Okay, we're now short, like we're a week out and we're still like, 20 members short. It's like creating a story around what you're doing is incredibly powerful. And like, I see a lot of local media guys doing this already, just in different sort of functions that aren't.
Well, in creating the story,
membership.
What it does is it allows like the consumer to be a participant in the story. Like that's the goal of the story. Yeah, exactly.
And so that they feel like they're part of it, right? And they want to support it. And like, because we have a real work that they're doing, they know that something will come of it. You're also setting like a target and a timeline. So like we need 30 new members to fund this series by October 31st. And so setting that deadline helps anchor it in people's minds that something has to be done by this point. And so putting that timeline really does help drive a lot of stuff. And we do see like, 30% of members maybe come in that last like maybe week out of a month campaign. And so it's like, tying a lot of these little pieces in to create like a campaign arc does so much better than just like, hey, can you throw us 3 new members to support us, right? It's like giving people a reason why, and a story can be very compelling. And that, nonprofits and charities have done this, incredibly well. And news publications are increasingly starting to do it more.
Mm-hmm. Really quick, I want to talk about the pricing. I understand that you have different pricing for the different newsletters, based really on like the competition of the market. It's much more competitive in Vancouver compared to Ottawa, so you've had to price it a little lower, right?
Yeah, pricing was sort of finicky. We definitely fooled around with like a bunch of different pricing. Like we tried it, quite a bit higher, didn't really work. So we've lowered it down. Like Ottawa's $125, Vancouver's $99 for a year, exactly. And like I said, I think about 75% of 80% of our members are paying yearly, and we optimize for that. So the discounts are usually yearly, not monthly.
And also, actually, I meant to ask too regarding the December drive. Is that discounted at all?
Yeah. So usually what we'll do is we'll start it, run it for like half the time without a discount, introduce a discount as part of it. Generally speaking, it'll be our biggest discount of the year too. So people know like that's coming up, and we can say it's the biggest one. And so we do get a ton of members from that as well, because there's that anticipation, and it's the end of the year. So people know that there's like a real hard deadline there.
Yeah.
On the pricing side too, like I said, we tried, paying for the food journalism as a separate subscription, and then like combining the two together as like a discounted one. And then, so we've tried a bunch of different things. It's been very messy, but the last year we've definitely nailed it down and feel pretty good about it. But it does depend on the market too.
With
right?
the food journalism, sorry, really quick. So you also have like, you've got a separate food journalism product for Ottawa, but not for Vancouver. For Vancouver, it's just part of the one product. Why is that?
That is actually just like purely technical. Like we shouldn't have frankly done it that way, because of the way like Beehive works. We really should have had it under one thing.
You have to pay more.
So the way the Vancouver one works, and this is what I would recommend, is like we have one website. And so it's a bit like ad hoc-y, like there's not really a perfect situation. But the Vancouver one is like, we have the main newsletter list, and then we have a food list, but the paywall on the website is on the news website. So we just sync memberships between the two. So like the free ones are all on the Beehive food list, so that they can access all the paywalled stuff. And so it's a bit like you're working with like, the tools as they are, right? So like a multi-publication type thing. The challenge we've run into with Ottawa, not to get too deep into it, is like sharing subscriptions, different websites, different brands. Like when we go forward for the rest of our publications, we'll definitely be keeping them under sort of like one brand. It's worked really well in Ottawa, I would say, but it's more just like it adds another website that I have to manage, which is less fun than doing just one.
Yeah. Last thing on paid subscriptions for now. You mentioned again just now that people weren't necessarily being converted on the food journalism. What have you found really does not work? Like, what have the failures been in trying to convert people to paid subscriptions?
Well, recently, actually, I can talk about one. Like we just did. So the FIFA World Cup is coming to Vancouver, as part of everywhere and in North America.
To Thomas Muller's Vancouver.
Yeah, exactly. He's ours now. But I've had a theory that this would, engage a lot of people and be a thing that would drive a lot of membership stuff in it. And it hasn't really necessarily done that in the same way. And so like these individual like issues in Vancouver maybe are just like less resonant than a place in like Ottawa, let's say, or we just didn't get enough, pre-engagement on the survey to like determine that this was actually an issue that we should or shouldn't run on. And that was a learning for me. Like we need more early signs to push forward on something like that. So that's been a big one. I would say the people not willing to pay for food journalism is another one. Like Godspeed to all those, people doing Substack food journalism stuff. Like it is tough. So that's been another one on the membership side. Getting the paywall stuff right has been a real challenge, I would say. Like we just tried, really discounted like $1 for 3 months type.
Just as a way of like, let's see if we can get them addicted to it, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And like didn't work at all. And now that may just be like we didn't push it properly or that type of thing. But You do see a lot of this in other subscription-based publications where you're doing like $1 for 6 months, like $10 for a year, and then a higher price thing. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to work. And I think maybe one theory is that like it's not a publication that you need per se, in the sense of like like
I could just go to Google Maps and look at the stars and check out some reviews.
Well, and that's it for the food journalism, especially. It's like it's more of a utility function, and so like that's why the writer of it, is more important. So yeah, there's been like a few little things like that, but I think we've gotten the membership stuff to a better spot now in terms of what we offer.
Are you tired of explaining the same thing over and over again to your coworkers? It's time to let AI do the explaining for you. Guide is a GPT-powered tool that helps you explain even the most complex tasks in seconds with AI-generated documentation. Just hit Capture on the Guide browser extension, and it automatically creates a step-by-step video guide complete with visuals, voiceover, and a call to action. Now you can turn boring docs into stunning visual guides, share or embed them anywhere, and save hours every week. And the best part, the Guide extension is completely free. Go check it out at guide.com. That is GUIDDE.com. You said that that Lookout is profitable. How long did it take to reach profitability? You've been around for 4 years.
I think like profitability is tough, right? Because my co-founder also didn't really take a salary for a while. So like when people talk about like profitability, it's always like you got to get a little bit under the hood on that. Like if I was paying myself a salary right now, it wouldn't be profitable in that sense, right? But I would say like, year 2, year 1.5, I knew we had something. Year 2 was like, okay, we can pay my colleague like a decent salary. So for a while, and like I don't operate a business I would never be willing to operate this in a deficit. I'm just like too risk averse. So like again, going back to the EOS system, I have a very clear budget projections. What are things going to cost? I only hire if like I can do a year of, say, year to 9 months of these costs without any sort of like real impact. There's no perfect formula for it, but I am a very conservative person. I think that's been the mistake in media for a long time, is like trying to grow too fast, and seeing this in some media companies in Canada, like, 6 a.m. City's growing really fast. Like I do wonder like how long that can be sustainable. Some of these other places, like I think that's been the mistake is growing.
What was it, like the Messenger last year? They raised a ton of money, shut down really quick.
Burned it. That's a great example. So, and look, like these journalists that I've hired, like their expectation is that, we're going to run a sustainable operation so that they can stay there and do their work forever. And I take that trust incredibly, incredibly seriously. And so it's all about making decisions that are, sustainable for not just the publication, but for the team that we have, right? So yeah, it's a lot of number crunching and making sure that you're following stuff, and we are profitable and will continue to be profitable for the foreseeable future.
When you first hit that profit, we could put in quotes profitability with the aside of your own labor. So when you first hit that profitability, though, around 2 years in, how many newsletters were there? And was the subscription and ad revenue mix still about 75-25?
No, it was like 90-10. So 90% members, 10% ads. 2 years in, and we were just Ottawa then. So it was basically like once you can get a one of these ones to a point of like sustainability, profitability, then you can think about expanding, because then you have a bit more runway to be able to do this stuff. So you're not like, you're not losing a ton of money immediately. I mean, there's that runway now. Like I think, based on how I'm seeing things, it's like a year and a half towards profitability for a publication if we do it slow. Now there's different, like you could spend a bunch more money on Facebook ads to grow that really quickly. Now we have a salesperson. Maybe that changes as well too, but you kind of have to have the budget to account for that.
Yeah. Let's talk about ad sales. So 25% ads. I understand you're selling to plenty of local businesses that you might have to do some education on like what it means to advertise in a newsletter, what to expect. Tell me about your process for selling ads in the newsletter, and how that's changed as well since you've been able to hire someone.
Well, I've definitely drawn a lot from a lot of the people that you've interviewed, because sales is not my area of expertise, though. Like I'm very comfortable talking about this stuff. The challenge on the newsletter ad side, and I would say this is like a key component on the local media piece, is there is a serious level of low level of sophistication when it comes to running ads. Not that local advertisers don't know how to do this stuff. It's just newsletter ads are new and haven't penetrated to that local level. So there's a level of education that comes with this where it's like, okay, this is a newsletter ad. This is not a banner ad on a website that's going to appear for a month, right? You're going to get all your impressions in a couple days. And so that education piece is really, really tough, and hurdling that can be a real challenge. So like over time, we've altered our media kit and pitch deck to be more about like a bit of an education piece. If someone is, a lot of our ads, basically all our ads recently, up until recently, have come from inbound requests. I've done no outbound work, just because I don't have time, and membership drives most of our revenue. So the people who come in have a little bit of experience with us, so it's a little bit different. But the cold selling, it's different. It's like we have to educate people on that, and again, draw from a lot of what other people are doing because they're much better at it than me. But the other piece I'd say is like, on the local side, it's like being able to show that you're reaching like a certain subset of people. Like one reason we're expanding, hopefully, into sort of more neighborhood-based newsletters and things like that is because there's a demand for it. It's, being able to go to a local business and say, I can reach 5,000 people in this one little community. That's a pretty effective pitch versus maybe a broader message. So it's a bit of experimentation, seeing what works, and like, I'm very bullish on it, about it in the future, but it's been such a low piece of our focus just because of what I'm spending time on.
A couple questions about the advertisers themselves. One, are there like one or two businesses you could give as an example that have been your most frequent advertisers that you've worked with for a long time?
A lot of events. So like the events are very cyclical. They know that because of the research we've done with our surveys, that like 30-40% of our audience says they've either they've attended an event because of what they've seen, or have considered attending an event based on what they've seen. So that data point has been really useful to sell to advertisers. We had like an environmental housing group that had, signed up for a 6-month contract to sort of like push the different projects that they were doing on home stuff, which has been super popular. Real estate businesses have been really interested because like the stuff is really engaging. But on the flip side of that is like, just because we get, 1,000, 1,500 clicks on a home, we can't sell it for a lot because people are kind of clicking on it because they like the design of the home, right? Yeah. So exactly. So you have to understand like who your audience is, what they're willing to do. Like we've experimented with financial products recently and have had a little bit of less success on that. So it's sort of like, you're monitoring, you're seeing how it goes, and then you're trying to go to new businesses to sort of pitch that stuff. And like, we've sort of identified some different industries that we want to go after, and so we're working on that in more of an outbound perspective. But it's mostly entirely been inbound.
Are these businesses, and I'm sure it's maybe too broad of a spread for you to even paint it with broad strokes here. I'm curious where else they're already advertising. Is like other local media products? Are they doing meta ads?
Mostly local, like other local media businesses. So it's like we want them to consider us as part of their next media mix in a lot of situations, right? And so I think part of the challenge, and this is just, I'd be interested in chatting with other groups on this too, but there's a balance of like, how do you sell it? Is it purely an intent-based thing that you can get a sale from this, or is it a function of like building the brand in the local community? I think the challenge is if you're trying to go up against Google search and Facebook ads from a performance standpoint, you're not going to be able to beat that, right? Yeah. as someone who runs an agency and does this stuff, like you're not going to be able to beat it. But where you can beat it on is like, this is a trusted space to run your ads, that you're going to build a relationship with our readers over time because we have that trust. And when they come to make that purchase decision, so like thinking of the newsletter ads as higher up in the funnel rather than necessarily just lower, that's where the real value, I think, is unlocked with this stuff, is selling against a brand intent education piece more so than just a direct purchase, because you can tell them, you're going to be in a safe, trusted place, that your brand is going to, have a much higher lift. And like, if you've done the surveys to like, ask readers what they think about stuff, there are some compelling points that you can use to help sell that for sure.
On the topic of being unable to beat meta ads, like this is from a podcast as well from the beginning of the year. I understand that 90% of your growth, which at that time was around 100,000 subscribers, 90% of your growth has come from Meta with about a 60 to 70 cent cost per acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, it would be 60 to 70% Canadian,
Okay.
or no, sorry, 60 to 70 cents on the low side of things. Now, what we've actually done, and not to give a plug to Beehive here, but I'm going to do it, is like over time you can see like how these audience segments work and the engagement levels. So like while I can go out and run ads on like food content and get 60 to 70 cent leads, those people don't convert to members at the same rate as like one ad that asks about news, right?
Yeah.
So while I pay like more now for leads, the quality of the lead is much higher because the end goal that I'm optimizing for is very different than just getting a low cost lead. So I am suspect sometimes when I do see like low cost leads, I believe a lot of it because like you can get really low cost local leads. But there is a difference between acquiring someone who like may open a newsletter for a little bit versus acquiring someone who's eventually going to give you $100.
This is, I mean, going back to what we were talking about half an hour ago or so about maybe journalists not having never heard of an EOS, these kind of lingos and terms and frameworks. I think just this basic concept of like, well, what's the lifetime value, or LTV as the acronym goes, of a subscriber, and then that's how you justify even doing meta ads in the first place. That's what allows you to invest in that.
Yeah, exactly. Knowing those numbers is really important. And like, I don't know, on the Stripe dashboard, it changes every day depending on when people churn. But it's, thinking through that's why it's so important to set out at the beginning that it's like, we're going to run a membership-based publication, because then the sort of basic premise of, okay, membership organization means we need high quality people who are going to become members. If I just said we're running an impression-based business that's going to deliver ads, I would optimize every other downstream decision completely different to get to that point, right? So starting at the beginning and working your way forward is so important, because all those decisions have cascading effects of what we do. And so like with our food publication, now we know that like we can actually get money from people from events rather than membership. So like I've told our reporter, scale down the member only newsletter posts we're doing, because like I know now that we can make more money from events. And so, optimizing towards that type of stuff helps make those other decisions. So if you have your north guiding stars of like what your goal is, what you're optimizing towards, it makes a lot of these other things so much easier. And not to like completely go on a different tangent, but I do see this a lot with a lot of like local newsletter operators where it's like, oh, I'm going to start this business off the side of this. I'm going to do this off the side of this. And it's like, sometimes you just got to stay focused on this stuff, right? You can do anything. Like with an audience, you could theoretically do anything, but anything means nothing if you're not like focusing in on sort of that outcome, right? So like, being judicious about what you're doing and knowing what you say no to, I think is also really important around making those decisions. But again, having the goal or the sort of like starting point of how you're doing it helps make a lot of those decisions a lot easier.
Yeah. Based on what you just said, so I wanted to ask your sort of, bird's eye view of this local media, local newsletter startup space, right? We've referenced some of the other guys I've spoken to and how you're doing some things a little bit differently. And the person I brought up, Ambreen Ali, who's doing things even more differently with grant funding. What is your 50-foot, 100-foot bird's eye view perspective of this like new media, local newsletter, local media space?
I'd say, I guess I'm like bullish and bearish on it, which is sort of like, a wishy-washy answer. But I think there's a couple pieces that I'm quite bullish on it, because I think that the new models that are coming out are going to build the journalism of the future, like the Mill in UK, just doing incredible local news stuff. And so I think that if you're marrying like really high quality journalism with really interesting writers and breaking down those barriers between people, and serving a need in these communities, like you're going to go really far. Where I'm a bit more bearish and like I would be a little bit more concerned to an extent is like when you see, 6 a.m. City talking about being able to go into like hundreds and hundreds of communities with AI newsletters of summaries of content and events that are happening. Well, my concern on that end is that one, if you're just doing an event summary newsletter, you're not creating enough of a moat to warrant someone sticking around forever. And then it just becomes an arbitrage game of how can I get the most people at the lowest cost. And then it's not really a local newsletter. It's a Facebook ad strategy.
Yeah.
Which, you can make money off that. And not to say you can't, but I think that's sort of the competitive landscape that we're dealing with. We're also dealing with AI that can summarize everything and put that into people's inboxes really quickly. And so, I think there's going to be a real challenge, I think, for some of these sort of like quick local news operators that spool up, because it's so easy to launch something and get going, that someone like 6 a.m. City can come into this place that maybe you've spent a couple grand on to get 3,000 people and just build that in a week. And so if it becomes a game of who can build the biggest audience to deliver, positive news summaries, I think some of these local news people might end up losing out to these bigger players, because if it's just an execution game of that and editorial doesn't matter, then it's just whoever has the most money, right? So that would be a concern on my end. But I think like the people who are doing it really well have built their own sort of like really strong brand around it too. And brand, there's a million different things you can do on that, like good graphics, the way you talk to people, presenting yourself, things like that. I think if you're playing the game of just summarizing stuff, I think in the long term, this is going to be a real challenging environment to win out in, especially if you're just playing that arbitrage game. And just the last piece is like, as we build up these like local newsletters everywhere, the CPMs are going to go down, right? There's way more inventory, and so we're already seeing that, I think, in a lot of space right now. So that's why you see a lot of these newsletter entrepreneurs talking about how it's like we move beyond the ad game and you have to find revenue from other spots. And I think that's 100% right. But I question, I guess, for some of these people who are just doing events and news summaries, like, is that possible? Maybe it is, but I think the competition there makes it a lot harder.
Yeah, I think I was gonna say, like, with Landon, Michael, and Ryan, right? These people I mentioned earlier, like, they are all really engaging with their communities, right? And like they're going to these events in person, they're talking to people, they're like building these relationships, and like that's the moat, right? Like that's the moat that protects them, that protects you from a 6 a.m. City and just this total like arbitrage, meta ads and then selling ads against it. Right? Like that, it's just being in person, being a member of your community. I think that's what people want. And I think that too is like talking to Landon about like what I forget what it's called, but like the equivalent of the Ottawa Citizen in Wichita, the one that's been around for 100 plus years and is now owned by a conglomerate. It's like they now, I'm paraphrasing Landon here, are just not as connected to the community. And so like that seems to be just what it comes back to, is like the moat is being a person in real life and talking to people.
Yes. That breaks it down from like the faceless brand into something that itself can be a moat, right? If you're inserting personality and you can be trusted, that's a huge differentiator. But I think like trying to scale that becomes like a little bit harder, because then again, it just goes back to like, how can I acquire an audience really fast and serve them, quick content, right? I mean, even like, I would just say like the trends that we're seeing in like YouTube stuff, like long form video content's increasingly popular, right? Mm-hmm. Even though like, obviously TikTok and this other stuff is really doing well, but if you're producing like really good stuff, I think it does stand out.
Yeah. One thing, so I know that your co-founder went to the Ottawa Citizen, right? Is there something here where like, again, I'm thinking of how difficult it can be to stand up a business like this, and how it technically wasn't profitable even when it was profitable, because you guys weren't necessarily taking an income. Is that like, I don't know if you want to get into this, but is that a thing where it's just like, this could not support two people putting in labor that wasn't being compensated?
I think so. And that's part of the challenge. I think like when you can do a startup off the side of your desk, you've got infinity runway, because you're able to sort of fund it from your own stuff. And like, with my colleague, like he was the first one who was paid, because he was doing, once we started getting money, he was basically starting being paid immediately, because he didn't have
a marketing agency.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and so that's sort of the balance piece, is like, you kind of have to build the business around like what you can and can't do. And I think for him too, like, he was looking for a little bit more stability too, which I completely understand. Like we're still very, very good friends and stuff like that. But it definitely depends on sort of like, where you're at and what you're doing. And like, I guess it also depends too on how you like working with people. I have friends who, 3 friends who started a business newsletter in Canada, The Peak, that was sold a couple of years ago, and they were just a great team that were able, to work together. But they also had a lot of like complementary skills and were able to scale up faster and had outside funding that gave them that runway. Like, this is not an outside funded publication. Like I, funded this entirely myself. So it's sort of like there's, so having an understanding of like who you're working with, where you want to go, like it worked for a while because we were very transparent and honest about how we wanted to approach things. And I think that's why the sort of like breakup, quote unquote, worked so well, because we knew we had this sort of stuff in place for that and knew what we both wanted, and we're working really closely together. So yeah, I mean, having a good team and hiring the right people, especially if you're thinking of taking that next step, like the people is the most important function. I would say the like you can have the best systems in place and the best training and stuff like that, but if you don't have the right team, it's just not going to work.
I'm like in all that, I'm trying to pull out like some piece of advice for, the journalist who maybe recently got laid off and is trying to start their own thing. Or, just the independent person creator who does not necessarily have the business background and is trying to stand something up. And like what I'm hearing is don't go it alone. It might seem intimidating because you're going to have to share any profits, the spoils, right? But like you're going to have a sure thing building something together with someone with complementary skills and not just trying to carry everything yourself.
I think if you're an entrepreneurial journalist, you have a unique niche that there's a lot of money in the industry, then it is much easier to do. And like you have a pre-existing audience that you can do this to. But like, we don't do any social media stuff. Like all our audience has come from like organic sharing and paid ads. And that's just because that's my background to be able to grow that. And so I wouldn't have been able to do this without that. But for the journalist who's just starting out and, if they don't have those specific skills, it's definitely a lot harder, and that's where finding someone can be really beneficial, right? And so, like, if you do end up finding someone, it's really critical that you like join with them quickly and sort of build that structure that's going to work, because finding the right people is the most important thing, whether it's someone you're joining with or hiring on a freelance basis, that type of thing.
Yeah. If $100,000 landed in Lookout's bank account today, how do you use it?
I would hire a managing editor. So we are hiring sort of like a senior editor right now, but I would basically like not to get again too deep into the business,
Please
but
do.
Every sort of thing is like removing me from part of that equation. So the next step is to bring someone on who can help the journalists do a lot of the editorial stuff. So reviewing stuff, working with them on editorial calendar, things like that. So then I can go work on, okay, let's launch another newsletter in another city, and I can work with that journalist. So each sort of function of money that we're using right now is replacing a role that I'm doing, so that I can then do that role again in somewhere else, because we know, like, I sort of know the model now in these different cities about what works, and it's more just like having the resources to be able to just honestly be able to execute on it, because that's the other thing, is like execution is like 80% of the game. Everyone has a million ideas, but if you're not going to if you can't execute it on it well, it's just not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Last question then. You've been doing this for 4 years, almost exactly. In 4 years, how many different cities would you hope to be in?
I'd love to be in like 5 or 6, I would say. I think 5 would be a good number. And then we'll hopefully be doing like neighborhood newsletters in every city too. Like, I think if you were looking at like what the Lookout looks like, it's similar to Chicago Block Club. It's similar to like what the UK, the Mill is doing. And it's not so much just the cities too, right? It's like, I would love our journalism to be even better. Just like basically like we're getting there in Ottawa. I think we're pretty close, but I really believe like we can have the best journalism brand in each city we operate in, because of how the model works and what we're writing about and things like that. So that's sort of like, we've got our 10-year, 3-year goals, but that's sort of a big one, is like be the most trusted brand with our audience for news. And I think we're well on our way for that.
I love it. Well, we'll end it here. Geoff, thank you for coming on.
Great to be here. Thanks again.
Of course. And listener, we will see you next week.
If you've just listened to that entire episode and you want to learn more about local newsletters, this episode is for you. episode 38 with Michael Kaufman. It's one of our most popular episodes. Michael gives some great information on how to build a great brand, growing organically, and how to build a sustainable revenue model. Go listen to it. Tell us what you think.